Before we gets to the video, give me a proper thumbs up, smash that subscribe button, hit the hype thing, and tell me in the comments what race's rules you'd want to live under. Thanks, ya gits! If you want it even more brutal, more comedic, or more Waaagh, just say the word!
Death at the hands of an orc. I used to think that would be the worst fate imaginable. I was wrong. There's something far more nightmarish living under an orc's rule. My name is Andrej Marcek. I'm a manufacturing worker, well, I was, before all this, on the planet Veridian Prime. Once I was a loyal citizen of the Imperium of Man, waking each day to the toll of the Hab-block bell, saying my prayers to the God Emperor, and going about my mundane, peaceful life. Now I wake each day in a cold sweat, under the cracked sky of a world ruled by a greenskin warboss. I'm a survivor, one of the wretched millions living in the shattered skeleton of our city, under the boot of a hulking alien who has declared himself our planetary governor. Yes, you heard that right. The governor of our world is an Ork Warboss, and he's not exactly known for his gentle administrative touch. Every morning, just before dawn, I'm jolted awake by the same ritual. A guttural roar blares from loudspeakers across the city, the ones that still work, delivering the day's orders from our new overlord. The voice on the Vox is usually human, but it's trembling with terror. It's one of the few unlucky survivors who speak the Orcs' language and are forced to act as translators. In broken High Gothic, he relays whatever garbled command the warboss grunts that day. Sometimes it's a work mandate. All gets to report to the factorums. Outputs too low. Move your butts or else. Other days, it's a sick joke. Today, the boss says everyone gets extra squig ration. Lucky you, huh? That usually means the warboss had a good fight the night before and is in a rare, generous mood. Occasionally, it's an ominous decree. Curfew starts an hour early tonight. Any humie out after dark will be shot on sight. No excuses. There's no appeal, no discussion. Just a one-way broadcast that we've learned to obey if we value our lives. This is my life now, a grim parody of civilization where human dignity is a distant memory and fear rules every waking moment. I have become the unwilling narrator of a grotesque documentary, Life Under the Orc Occupation. And truth be told, parts of it are so absurd that if you weren't living it, you'd think it was some sick comedy. The orcs are brutal, murderous beasts, yes, but they have a twisted sense of humor in their cruelty. In moments between the panic and despair, I've caught myself marveling at the sheer insanity of it all. It's like the galaxy's darkest joke. The aliens known for their love of mindless destruction have decided to settle in and govern our world, as if they even understand the concept. It would be funny if it weren't so damn horrifying. So how did we get here? How does an entire Imperial planet fall under the sway of an Ork warlord playing governor? Let me take you back to the day it all fell apart. The day the greenskins came. I remember it in fragments of terror and clarity, as one remembers a nightmare. It was early morning, just after third bell. I was standing in my modest hab unit, sipping a cup of recaf and watching the pale sun rise over the manufacturum stacks. The sky was a hazy orange-gray, the usual color when dawn light mixes with the smog of factory chimneys. I could see the distant silhouette of our city's pride, the administratum spire and the governor's palace, jutting into the sky. That's when the sirens began to wail. A chill ran down my spine. Those weren't the routine shift-change sirens, but the deep warbling cry of the planetary air raid alarms. I barely had time to process it when the first explosions rumbled in the distance. I rushed to my window and scanned the heavens. Streaking through the sky were dozens of fire trails, like meteors showering down. But meteors don't zigzag or leave contrails of smoke from ground fire. Within minutes, the distant thumping of our ground-based macro cannons joined the cacophony. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were under attack, and judging by the green-tinged contrails and the sheer madness of the flight patterns, it could only be one foe: orcs. Veridian Prime had known peace for generations. We weren't a fortress world or a hive with standing armies of space marines. We had a small planetary defense force, brave but modestly equipped, and a few orbital defense lasers. We all grew up on stories of distant wars, of heroic Imperial Guard regiments and the Emperor's space marines holding the line against Xenos horrors. But for us, war was a far-off concept, something that happened on Piektkeets or in the off-world news. Until that morning, the next hours passed in a blur of panic and violence. I remember running down 12 flights of stairs to get to the ground level. The elevators shut down when the city went into emergency lockdown. People were screaming, shoving, stampeding like spooked cattle. Somewhere nearby, a Voxcaster was blaring an emergency message over and over. Xenos invasion in progress. All civilians seek shelter. PDF units, report to muster points. Remain calm. By order of Governor Thail, remain calm. The recording didn't sound very calm at all by the end. I did my best to seek shelter as instructed. Along with dozens of others, I squeezed into an old Adepta Sororitas chapel built into the base of our hab block. It was basically a fortified basement with rockcrete walls. Maybe not purpose-built for war, but one of the sturdiest places around. There were maybe 50 of us, men, women, crying children clinging to their mothers. The local Ministorum priest, Father Emil, was there too, clutching his Aquila pendant and muttering prayers almost too fast to comprehend. We all flinched with each tremor from above. The muffled thumps of explosions and distant rattle of heavy bolter fire created a dreadful symphony. At some point, the ground shook so violently, I thought the hive tower was coming down on top of us. Dust rained from the ceiling. By then, the lights had flickered out, so we huddled in darkness lit only by a few makeshift glow lamps. In the dim flicker, I caught sight of something that turned my blood to ice. Green skin moving past a narrow basement window at street level. There was guttural shouting, that unmistakable orc language, like the barking of an angry monosyllabic beast, and the distinct whoomph of a flamethrower. An orange glow filled the tiny window, and above, faintly, we heard people screaming. The orcs were in the city, and they were purging every building they found. Memories of that moment still haunt me. I was crouched behind an overturned pew. That old chapel became our bomb shelter, ironically. And next to me was a young mother named Celine. She held her little boy in her lap. He must have been 5 years old, maybe 6. The kid was shaking like a leaf, eyes wide, too scared even to cry. Celine herself was pale as death, but she was whispering to him something like, "It's okay, baby. The Emperor protects. Just close your eyes." I wanted to believe her words so badly. I clutched the small silver Aquila charm around my neck, a gift from my wife, Karina, and prayed silently, "Please, Emperor, protect her. Wherever she is right now, please keep her safe." I hadn't seen my wife since we parted ways that morning. She worked at the Administratum archives across town. I didn't even know if she was alive at that point. That thought threatened to swallow me in fear, so I forced myself to focus on the present. Survive now, pray for loved ones later. After what felt like an eternity, the tide of battle seemed to ebb. The explosions grew more sporadic, moving from a constant roar to distant booms. The shooting outside our hiding place faded, Eventually, there was a long stretch of eerie silence broken only by distant, inhuman laughter echoing through the streets. A few of us exchanged uncertain looks. Were the orcs gone? Had the PDF somehow repelled them? Our answer came not long after, in the form of a Voxcaster broadcast that every device and public address system in the city seemed to carry. The voice was clipped, panicked. Governor Thale himself, speaking live. "Citizens of Veridian Prime," he said, "all is not lost. Remain in your shelters. I have dispatched envoys to negotiate a ceasefire." There was a pause, static, some muffled shouting in the background. Negotiate? With orcs? The thought seemed absurd. "Reinforcements are on their way," he continued, though it sounded like a lie he wanted to believe. "By the grace of the Emperor, we will endure this. All PDF units, fall back to the palace. We will make our stand, The message cut off with a burst of deafening noise, an explosion or gunfire right next to the microphone. What followed was chaos on the airwaves. I heard people screaming, then an unmistakable guttural bellow. The transmission ended abruptly in a burst of static. That was the last official command from our planetary governor. Unofficially, that broadcast told us everything. The palace had been breached. The orcs weren't in retreat at all. They were closing in on the heart of our city, and the governor's desperate plea had just been silenced, likely along with the man himself. Not long after, the reinforced doors of our chapel shelter shuddered. We all went rigid. For a second, I feared an explosion would rip through, but instead we heard the scrape of metal on the other side. The door was being pried open. Father Emil raised his shaking hands, intoning, "Emperor, receive our souls," preparing for the worst. A handful of PDF soldiers burst in, rifles raised. For a heartbeat, we thought it was the enemy, but they were human, soot-stained, bloodied, their flak armor in tatters, but human. "Anyone alive in here?" one shouted. We all babbled at once, relief and renewed fear mixing. If they were here, it meant the orcs weren't far behind. The soldiers began motioning for us to follow. "Evacuation order," a sergeant barked. "Palace defenses have fallen. We're pulling back to secondary positions." Even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that there were no secondary positions. Not really. Still, fleeing that basement felt better than waiting to be burned alive in it. We hurried out into the street under their direction. Emperor preserve us. The street was unrecognizable. Where there had been hab buildings and market stalls a few hours ago, there were now smoldering craters. Twisted metal, rubble, and bodies littered the avenue. The smell hit me first, the acrid bite of smoke and promethium mixed with the sickly sweet stench of charred flesh. I nearly retched on the spot. One of the PDF troopers urged us on, waving his last gun, and we stumbled forward, stepping over debris and corpses. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help it. I recognized a face in the rubble, or half of one. It was old Mr. Sal, who ran the corner noodle stall where I'd often bought dinner. His kind eyes were glazed over now, staring at nothing, his lower body pinned under a collapsed wall. I had to suppress a sob and keep moving. Overhead, the sky was crisscrossed with columns of black smoke. I saw a trio of our aerospace defense fighters streak past, hotly pursued by what looked like flying saucers belching green tracers. Ork fighter bombers. One of the fighters corkscrewed, trailing fire, and slammed into a hab block a few kilometers away. The explosion blossomed like a cursed flower, and moments later a thunderous whump and shockwave reached us. The orcs were everywhere, on the ground, in the sky, like a plague of destruction. We refugees, maybe 200 of us from various shelters, were herded down Avenue of the Martyrs, a grimly fitting name now, toward the city center. The PDF squad was trying to take us to the Basilica of Saint Catherine, which they said had been designated an evacuation point. Perhaps some shuttles were supposed to land there. we'd never find out. As we passed an intersection, a massive shadow fell over us. With a metallic stomp, an Ork war machine barreled into view. It was like a nightmare given form, a crude bipedal walker 5 times the height of a man, cobbled together from rusted armor plates and industrial pistons. A spindly Ork dreadnought, or death dread, I would later learn to call it. Its arm ended in a whirring saw blade the size of a door, and its other arm was a massive claw already slicked with gore. The PDF sergeant screamed, "Scatter!" Wise advice, but far too late. The walker let out a burst of machine gun fire from a turret on its shoulder. I dove behind a burnt-out ground car. Several others weren't so lucky. I heard bullets tearing into flesh, people crying out. The little boy I'd seen in the chapel fell to the ground, his mother shrieking as she tried to shield him. Emperor. Even now, I can hardly dwell on that image without my hands shaking in anger and sorrow. The dreadnought waded into our midst, swinging its saw in a wide arc. It cut through civilians and even a couple of its own accompanying Ork boys in its frenzy. There was blood everywhere. The PDF fired back in disciplined volleys, some shots sparking off the machine's hull. One lucky lashbolt hit a fuel line, and flames spurted from the dreadnought's side, causing it to stagger. The Ork pilot, visible through a cage of metal at the front, a greenskin face locked in a permanent, furious grin, howled something obscene. In that moment, a miracle, or so it seemed, descended upon us. A streak of golden light and thunder. An Imperial Navy Valkyrie dropship, bristling with guns, roared overhead. Its side hatches opened and heavy bolters unleashed a torrent of explosive rounds. The shells pummeled the already flaming dreadnought, blowing off one of its legs. The machine toppled over with a deafening crash, its pilot's howls silenced as it exploded in a fireball. For a heartbeat, we survivors actually cheered. Reinforcements. Perhaps Governor Thale hadn't been entirely lying after all, but that flicker of hope died almost immediately. The Valkyrie that saved us was limping, smoke trailing from one engine. It swung around, maybe to attempt a landing. That's when a green flash lanced out from somewhere and struck the dropship square in the tail. Some Ork looted anti-air gun had found its mark. The Valkyrie spun, tilted, and smashed into a manufactorum stack in the distance, blowing apart in a fireball. I remember the burning fuselage plummeting out of sight. There were no more signs of Imperial aircraft after that. If any others got through the Ork barrage, I didn't see them. After the dreadnought's destruction, our group splintered. In the chaos, I found myself alone, ducking down a side alley, running on pure adrenaline and animal instinct. I know, in that moment I wasn't thinking of bravery or helping others. I was in flight mode, pure and simple. The guilt of that still gnaws at me, though I've since done things I hope atone for it. Explosions continued to rock the city, but gradually pockets of gunfire became more isolated. The battle was burning out. The Orks had taken what they wanted. Eventually, creeping through rubble and smoke, I realized I was near the central plaza in front of the governor's palace. Or what used to be the palace. Emperor, have mercy. The grand domed building was shattered, great chunks of marble and adamantium strewn across the plaza. Fires raged where ornate gardens once stood, and there, amidst the ruin, I saw him for the first time, the Warboss. He stood atop a mound of debris that might once have been the governor's wing of the palace. Even at a distance, he was an imposing brute, easily 3 or 4 meters tall, bulging with muscle and encased in heavy scrap metal armor. His skin was a deep, dark green, crisscrossed with scars. A trophy rack jutted from his back, hanging with grisly tokens. I spotted what looked like the banner of our PDF 12th Regiment, now torn and stained alongside skulls of some unfortunate defenders. In his massive paws, he carried a warhammer almost as big as an Astartes, a crude thing made from a repurposed chunk of tank tread attached to a pole. Dried blood dripped from its serrated edges. Around the warboss swarmed a sea of smaller orcs, cheering and hollering, firing their guns into the sky in triumph. There were hundreds of them in that plaza alone. My heart sank at the sight. Any lingering notion that some pockets of our military still held out was dashed. The greenskins owned the heart of our city now. The warboss raised one huge clawed hand and bellowed something in his foul tongue. The other orcs immediately fell silent, aside from the occasional excited grunt. Then, to my surprise, he spoke again in a rough approximation of Low Gothic, our language. His voice was a deep rumble, like boulders grinding together, amplified by some crude speaker system on his armor. "Humies!" he roared. "This world is mine now. Your boss is dead, your city is smashed, and I is in charge." I will never forget those words, broken and accented though they were. An orc, a creature we were taught is interested only in wanton destruction, was essentially declaring victory and claiming authority. I crouched behind a half-collapsed statue, ironically a statue of the Emperor that had been toppled and defaced by the orcs. They'd painted a crude grin and fangs on the holy visage. From there, I watched the horror unfold. A group of captive humans, mostly PDF soldiers stripped of weapons, and a few civil officials in torn uniforms, were dragged before the warboss. Among them, stumbling and bloody, was Governor Thale. Miraculously, he was still alive, though clearly wounded. His ornate governor's coat was in tatters, and one of his arms hung limp. Two burly orc knobs held him on his knees. The warboss clomped down from his debris mound to loom over the defeated governor. Thale looked up, trembling but defiant. I was close enough now, maybe 30 meters, hiding behind rubble, to catch some of their exchange. The governor managed to speak, voice cracking. You will pay for this outrage. The Imperium will send retribution. We do not yield." Brave last words, but they only amused the warboss. The giant orc threw back his head and let out a booming laugh that echoed across the plaza. His boys joined in, a cacophony of savage mirth. Then, with a speed belying his size, the warboss snatched up Governor Thale by the neck. Thale was not a small man, but in the orc's massive claw, he looked like a rag doll. The warboss held him high, turning so all the captives and any hidden onlookers like myself could see. "This here was your leader, yeah?" the warboss growled, spitting aside. "Well, I'm the leader now. The big boss, Governor Grutzdrag, at your service." He gave a mock bow, even as Thale kicked helplessly in his grip, strangling. That name he gave, Grutzdrag, I burned it into my memory with hatred. That was the name of the brute who destroyed my world. With a snarl, the warboss, Grutzdrag, tightened his grip and, Emperor forgive me, popped Governor Thale's head clean off his shoulders. Just like that, one moment a living man, defiant and proud, the next a headless corpse tossed aside like garbage. A collective gasp and wail rose from the captives and any civilians close enough to see. Some fell to their knees in despair. I felt hot tears in my eyes and bile in my throat. Our governor had been many things, flawed, perhaps, but he was our lawful ruler, the Emperor's appointed. Seeing him executed by this alien monster, it broke something in me. Grutzdrag held up Thale's severed head by the hair, turning slowly in a grotesque display. "Any of you guys don't like it," he shouted. "This is what you get. I'm the warboss and the governor now." The orcs erupted in cheers of approval, stomping and firing into the air. The captives cringed and sobbed. My stomach churned with equal parts terror and fury. And then, as if to punctuate the ordeal, the Warboss did something truly bizarre. He put on the governor's ornate hat. Yes, amid the carnage, he somehow noticed Governor Thale's ceremonial furred cap lying in the rubble. It had fallen when Thale was grabbed. Grotstreg picked up the rather small hat, squinted at it, and jammed it onto the top of his thick skull. It sat absurdly perched on one side, far too small to fit properly. The sight was so ridiculous I almost let out a hysterical laugh, but I caught myself clapping a hand over my mouth. Wouldn't do to have the orcs notice me laughing at their boss. Actually, the surrounding orcs found it hilarious too. Many guffawed and whooped at their leader's fancy new headgear. Warboss Grotstreg grinned, clearly pleased with himself. In that insane moment, wearing a dead man's hat and surrounded by cheering killers, he looked like some monstrous caricature of a lord. By nightfall of the first day, Veridian Prime was firmly under Ork control. Our PDF had been slaughtered nearly to the last. A few surviving pockets likely fled into the hills or underground, but organized resistance was over. The orcs roamed the city freely, like wolves in a henhouse. Any civilians caught in the open were either rounded up or shot for sport. I remained in hiding as darkness fell, curled in a nook of that collapsed statue plinth, too afraid to move. The smell of smoke and death hung heavy. Somewhere a baby was crying incessantly, the sound rising and falling until it was abruptly cut off. I pray that perhaps someone managed to hush and save the child, but I know it's equally likely an orc got to them. Eventually, an orc patrol with blazing torches and crude searchlights passed near my position. I pressed myself into the shadows, hardly daring to breathe. They were dragging chains of prisoners behind them. I saw a mix of civilian folk and a few PDF troopers who had surrendered. One of the captives stumbled and an orc yanked him up by the arm, then casually blew his head off with a backhand swing of a spiked club. The body was left in the street as the patrol moved on. I'll never forget the sight of the chain of survivors shuffling past the corpse of their comrade, too terrified to even react. As the night deepened, the city that once was my home transformed into an alien, hellish landscape. Fires dotted the skyline. Our manufactorum district was an inferno. The orcs had torched much of it during the battle. Occasional tracer fire would arc up as some overeager greenskin shot at phantoms or celebrating in his own violent way. The Grand Administratum archives where my wife worked were just gone, a collapsed ruin belching smoke. I silently prayed Karina hadn't been there when it hit. Perhaps she was among those prisoners. That hope kept me sane. I refused to believe she was gone. I managed to catch a few moments of restless sleep in my hiding spot. When dawn of the second day arrived, the sun's rays revealed the full extent of the devastation. Entire city blocks were rubble, blackened craters marked where orc rockets or downed craft had hit. Our world was conquered, and now the occupiers set about securing their new prize. In the days immediately following the invasion, the orcs established a crude sort of order. It's important to understand, orcs aren't like disciplined soldiers who set up efficient occupation regimes. They're more like a mob of dangerous children, armed to the teeth, doing whatever their impulses suggest. But they do have a hierarchy of sorts, and Warboss Grotstreg was clearly at the top. What he wanted happened, usually through the blunt mechanism of yelling orders and cracking heads. I was eventually captured on day 2. After spending the morning creeping from ruin to ruin, trying desperately to find other survivors and to search for my wife or any sign of her, I wandered near a makeshift orc checkpoint by what used to be a transit station. A grot. Those are the smaller, sniveling cousins of orcs, often used as lackeys, spotted me and raised a shrill alarm. I was exhausted, unarmed, and alone. There was no escape. A pair of orc boys cornered me, their piggy eyes gleeful at finding a stray human. They knocked me to the ground with the butts of their guns and tied my wrists with coarse wire. I'll spare you the more humiliating details. Suffice to say, I was kicked around for their amusement, stripped of my jacket and valuables. The one thing I clung to, hidden in my boot, was my wife's silver Aquila pendant. By some miracle, they didn't find that. Eventually, I was hauled to a larger holding area that had been set up in our central rail depot. There, thousands of other human survivors huddled behind makeshift fences of barbed wire and vehicle wrecks. The orcs had basically corralled whoever they didn't kill outright. Men, women, children, a great unwashed, traumatized mass of us, guarded by swaggering orc fighters and a swarm of spiteful grots who took pleasure in poking anyone who pressed too near the fence. I scanned the faces desperately, heart pounding with both hope and dread. So many were injured, bandaged with dirty rags or nursing broken limbs. I saw fear, anger, grief, every expression of despair mirrored back at me 1,000-fold, but I did not see Karina. My wife was not among them. Each hour that passed without finding her name or face cut into me. To this day, I don't know her fate for certain, only that she never turned up in the living camps. Perhaps it's kinder not to know, but Emperor, I would have given anything for closure, one way or the other. The orcs kept us penned in that improvised camp for what felt like weeks, but in reality it was maybe 6 days. Time was hard to track. The orcs certainly weren't counting. They fed us sparingly. The occasional barrel of stagnant water rolled in, a few crates of rations, looted from our PDF stores, half of it spoiled or crushed. It was nowhere near enough. Hunger and thirst became our constant companions. People traded anything they had left for a sip or a scrap. A black market of sorts sprung up almost immediately among the prisoners. Someone found a stash of ration bars and was breaking them to trade for favors. An older fellow bartered his last pair of intact boots for a canteen of water. Misery makes merchants of us all, I guess. Orc guards would wander by, sometimes tossing in some nasty surprise for their own entertainment. One day, a couple of laughing orcs chucked a grenade, pin-pulled, over the fence into the center of the yard, just to watch us scatter and panic. It exploded and killed maybe a dozen people. The orcs cheered like it was a grand joke. After that, any semblance of morale or resistance in the camp evaporated. We were completely at their mercy, and we knew it. I recall one incident in that camp that still turns my stomach. A group of captives, former PDF soldiers, tried to stand up to an orc who was tormenting an elderly woman. The orc was poking at her through the fence with a sharpened rod, laughing as she cowered. One of the PDF men, in a flash of righteous anger, threw a stone and struck the orc on the face, drawing blood. A risky, foolish act, but also brave, I suppose. The orc guard, a scarred brute with one milky eye, went absolutely livid. He barged through the gate into the pen, bellowing, and dragged not only that soldier but 4 others out by their necks, anyone remotely near the front who might have been involved. We all watched, helpless and silent, as the orc lined the 5 men up in front of the fence. The soldier who threw the stone was still defiant. I saw him stand tall, looking the greenskin right in the eye. The orc sneered, raised a huge slugger pistol, and shot the man in the kneecap. He collapsed with a scream. Then, one by one, the orc executed the other 4 prisoners. Blam, 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 casual as can be, shooting each in the head. We on the other side of the fence cried out in horror. Some begged him to stop. The orc wasn't done. He turned back to the wounded, kneeling soldier, the one who had dared strike him, and said in broken Gothic, "Think you're tough, Humie?" The soldier, teeth gritted in pain, spat a glob of blood at the orc's feet, a final act of defiance. The orc responded by slowly pushing the barrel of his pistol into the man's mouth and pulling the trigger. The crack of the gun and the spray of red is something I won't forget. A collective moan of agony rose from us onlookers. Some of the children were wailing. The orc just laughed as he tromped back out of the pen, seeming quite satisfied with himself. After that, nobody in the camp even thought of fighting back again. We were too broken. On the 7th day, I think, of our internment, big changes took place. Warboss Graatsdreg himself came stomping into the depot yard, flanked by his entourage of knobs and a couple of mech boys. Orc engineers, tinkerers, identified by the many tools and random mechanical parts hanging off their persons. Graatsdreg surveyed us with those tiny red eyes of his, sizing up the stock of his newly acquired livestock, as it were. It made my skin crawl. He then gave an order. I didn't understand the Orcish, but soon its meaning became clear. The Orcs began sorting us. By brute force, they split us into groups. Anyone who looked young, strong, or useful, workers like me, surviving PDF who surrendered, mechanics, tech priests, doctors, was pulled into one group. Those who were very old, very young, sickly, or injured were herded into another. I wound up in the useful group, more due to my age and relatively intact health than any skill. Though I did shout, "I'm a factory hand, I can fix engines," when a snarling orc passed, hoping to make myself valuable enough to keep alive. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have basic mechanics training for the manufactorum. It must have helped, because the orc spared me more than a glance and moved on. It was heartbreaking and horrifying. Families that had survived together were now being torn apart. A mother from my Hab block, Larissa, tried to cling to her injured teenage son when orcs separated them. She was tossed aside, and her boy, his leg in a splint, was dragged to the useless pile. Larissa's screams of anguish still ring in my ears. The useless group, numbering perhaps a few hundred, were corralled to one side of the yard. Many of them knew what it likely meant and were sobbing or praying. Father Emil, the priest who'd been with us, was among them. I saw him making the sign of the Aquila over and over, his lips moving in last rites. Graatsdreg barked another command. The orc guards raised their guns. No! We realized exactly what was about to happen. Those of us in the spared group could only watch in frozen horror at what came next. With a series of deafening booms, the orcs opened fire on the useless prisoners. It was a slaughter. Men, women, children cut down in droves, mowed like grass. Some orcs tossed in grenades for good measure, blasting bodies apart in gouts of blood. The screams. Emperor, the screams seemed to go on forever, though I'm sure it was only seconds. Mercifully, it was over quickly for most. A few wails persisted from the pile of corpses, some wounded, not killed outright. The orcs approached and ended those cries with point-blank shots. I stood there, trembling, stomach heaving. There was nothing in it to throw up, otherwise I would have. Many around me were weeping or in shock. Graatsdreg made a loud sniff and snorted, as if satisfied that an unpleasant but necessary task was done. To him, it was probably like butchering excess Grok's herd that he didn't have feed for. The cold indifference shattered whatever remaining illusions any of us had. The orcs were not keeping us alive out of mercy. They simply had a purpose for some of us. When that purpose was done, well, we just saw what becomes of surplus humans. Thus, the survivors were winnowed to a more manageable number. Perhaps a few thousand remained in our city, out of a population of millions. Others likely scattered into the wilderness, but I doubt many would survive long. Veridian Prime's jungles are deadly even without orcs on the prowl. For better or worse, those of us sorted as useful became the foundation of the Orks' new slave workforce. With the sorting done, Warboss Grotstreg gave another speech, this time clearly directed at us, the living. He had that mangled governor's cap still perched on his head, which would have been comical if the scene around wasn't so tragic. The little grot translator who spoke human tongue was at his side with a amplifier horn. The gist of the speech was, "You work for me now. This is my world. Do what I say and maybe I let you live. Try anything funny and you'll end up like them." He gestured toward the heap of bodies that lay cooling and buzzing with flies nearby. Clear enough? And so began our new existence under Ork rule. The Orks wasted no time implementing their, I hesitate to call it a governing strategy, but that's essentially what it was. They had eliminated immediate resistance and culled the populace to a subservient pool. Now they set about bending the planet to their will. Grotstreg established his command post in the ruined governor's palace. He seemed to relish squatting in the seat of the authority he had usurped. His boys draped the palace in crude Ork banners, sheets of metal and canvas scrawled with jagged glyphs and crude symbols like big fanged mouths or upside-down Imperial aquilus with X's for eyes. The throne room became a literal throne room for him. They placed a towering chair assembled from wreckage. I suspect it was built out of pieces of a broken sentinel walker and the governor's own ornate marble throne smashed together. There, Grotstreg would hold court, receiving reports from his nobs and handing down brutal directives. One of the first decrees that filtered out to us was curfew. Every night, from sundown to sunrise, no human was allowed out in the streets. Any found outside would be shot on sight, no questions. Considering the Orks often spent their nights joyriding stolen vehicles through the streets or hunting surviving stragglers for sport, staying inside was a wise idea anyway. But they made it official. They painted warnings on walls in blood-red pigment, an orc skull and crossed axes symbol, meaning death, with the limited Gothic they knew. No go out, night, you die. A succinct summary. Another early policy. Disarmament. Any weapons left in civilian hands had to be surrendered. Not that many of us had weapons. Those were largely lost in the fighting. But the Orks systematically searched buildings, rounded up kitchen knives, makeshift clubs, even tools that could be used in defiance. They left us with only the bare essentials for work. I recall an Ork yanking a hammer right out of a worker's hand. Thereafter, even hammers and screwdrivers had to be checked in and out under guard when used in the factories. They knew enough to not trust us even with simple tools unchecked. Communication with the outside was, of course, severed. The Orks destroyed our astropathic choir building and every Vox transmitter they could find. Within days, Veridian Prime became a silent, isolated tomb as far as the wider Imperium was concerned. Occasionally at night, I'd see distant streaks in the upper atmosphere, probably the remains of orbital battles or ships fleeing. But no salvation came. In the initial weeks, I clung to the hope that a relief force would arrive. Surely the Imperium would respond, send Space Marines or at least an Imperial Guard regiment to liberate us. But as time dragged on and nothing came, reality set in. We were on our own. Much later, I learned why. A massive warp storm had erupted in our sector, severing astropathic communications for months. The Imperium likely didn't even know our fate until it was far too late. By the time any help could have been dispatched, we'd already been under the greenskin boot for a long while. Cruel fate, but that's war. After the initial culling, the Orks funneled us survivors back into a semblance of routine, only a grotesque shadow of the lives we once knew. They essentially said, "Get back to work, but now you work for us." They needed our skills and labor to consolidate their hold and to fuel whatever war effort they planned next. I was assigned to a manufactorum crew, unsurprisingly. Before the invasion, I worked at Vogan's fabrication plant, a factory that produced plasteel plating and mechanical components for agri-harvesters and the PDF's armored vehicles. Now, the same facility, or what was left of it, was repurposed to churn out goods for the orcs. Under armed guard, we were marched back to our workplaces. Many facilities had been damaged or wrecked in the war. So at first, our task was literally to clean up and get basic production running again. Picture it. The orcs level half our factory with their assault, then force us at gunpoint to sift through the rubble and reactivate the surviving assembly lines to make ammunition for them. The dark irony wasn't lost on any of us. Working conditions, as you can imagine, were hellish. If we thought our overseers under the Imperium were strict, that was nothing compared to an orc taskmaster with a whip. They installed a particularly unpleasant orc mech boss named Gorknik to supervise our manufactorum district. Gorknik was slightly smarter than the average orc, not saying much, and had a penchant for fixing machines by kicking or headbutting them. Emperor help me, I had to watch this brute operate sometimes. He'd wade into a delicate array of cogitator units and just start hammering at them with a wrench until sparks flew, then grunt in satisfaction when the lights flickered on. Never mind half the gauges were shattered. We line workers were effectively slaves. Days and nights lost meaning. We toiled until we dropped. Then we were dragged back to our assigned habs to catch whatever sleep we could before being yanked out again. The orcs provided minimal sustenance, watery gruel or charred meat of questionable origin, likely grox or disturbingly human in some cases. There were rumors some of the missing, useless bodies ended up roasted on spits for orc feasts. I try not to think about that. More often, they'd toss us raw squigs, ball-like fungus creatures that orcs breed for food. Ever bite into a live squig? Pray you never have to. It's like biting a rubbery, wiggling blood pudding that tastes of sour milk and engine oil. But hunger makes it a feast. Water was rationed out in communal troughs once a day. Given the orcs had shattered many of our water purification systems, what we drank was usually a brown, metallic-tasting sludge from the river, barely boiled. It often made us sick, but dehydration would kill faster, so we drank and retched and carried on. Illness, of course, ran rampant. In those early weeks, a lot of folks died from simple infections or untreated wounds. Orc medics, called pain boys, offered help occasionally, which usually meant they wanted human patients to practice gruesome surgeries on or to harvest organs for fun. We quickly learned to hide our sick and wounded from the orc orderlies that sometimes passed through. Better to take our chances with herbal wraps and prayer than fall into the hands of a pain boy. Yet, despite all the death and despair, human adaptability kicked in. We formed little support networks in the shadows. In my factory team, we quietly helped each other when possible, taking on a comrade's work when they were about to collapse to avoid drawing an orc's wrath, sharing a strip of dried squig meat here, a sip of cleaner water there, a whisper of kindness in the dark. It wasn't much, but it kept the spark of humanity alive. Let me paint a picture of a typical day under orc occupation, at least in those early months. Before dawn, an orc pounder, basically a big drum on wheels, comes rolling down the hab block row, beaten by a cackling grot. This is the orc version of a wake-up call. We shuffle out of our hovels. Most of us were crammed into whatever intact buildings remained. My group lived in the half-ruined shell of a skolam, school building. If you're not outside by the time the grot passes, you'll catch a whip or worse as they do head counts. Under the watchful eye of a couple of orc guards, we march to our assigned work site. The city, once relatively clean and orderly, now looks like a scrapyard crossed with a war zone. Ork fortifications made of stacked rubble and scrap metal block many streets. They've spray-painted crude symbols on almost every flat surface. Skulls, orc glyphs, insults to the Emperor. The bodies and gore from the invasion have largely been cleared. We did that unpleasant task, too. The orcs unceremoniously dumped corpses into huge mass graves or piled them up for burning. Still, the smell of death lingers under the omnipresent tang of machine oil and orc fungus. As we pass through the city square on our way to the Factorum, we see what's left of the great statues and monuments. Once marble effigies of Imperial saints and heroes dotted the plaza. The orcs had toppled most. One statue of Governor Thale, erected in his honor just last year, has been modified in typical orc fashion. They stuck a pole through the decapitated head and attached a crudely painted green orc face on top, mockingly turning it into an orc hero statue. A sign hung around its neck scrawls, "Guvna Gratz Dreg de Best." Every time I walk by it, I feel a mix of rage and bitter amusement at the sheer audacity. We reach the Manufactorum gates. 2 orc knobs and their pack of grots handle the roll call. The grots have clipboards taken from our admin buildings, though I highly doubt they can read. One by one, they call out or point and grunt, and we step forward to be patted down. They're looking for contraband, weapons, tools we aren't allowed to keep personally, anything sharp. One fellow ahead of me, Joran, had managed to hide a small screwdriver in his boot, perhaps hoping to use it to pick a lock or as a weapon. The grots found it. The supervising knob didn't ask any questions. He just grabbed Joran's hand and, with a wicked grin, drove that screwdriver straight through his palm. Joran screamed. We all winced. Then the knob yanked it out and tossed it aside, roaring with laughter while Joran collapsed, clutching his impaled hand. "No stealin' tools, git," the knob growled. Joran was sent to work with a mangled hand and no medical aid. He survived somehow, though his left hand is useless now. Such maimings were common. An orc's idea of mercy is leaving you alive minus a limb or two. Inside the Factorum, we're assigned stations. The assembly lines barely functioned at first, too much damage. But orc mech boys are resourceful in their own insane way. They had us rig up ad hoc fixes, bypassed power couplings with twisted wires, replaced broken conveyor belts with chains jury-rigged from tank treads. It was ugly, unsafe, and prone to breakdown. But slowly production resumed. Except now, instead of manufacturing farming equipment or civilian tools, we churned out weapons and war material for the orcs. Under pain of death, we toiled to make bullets that would likely be used to kill other humans someday, to refine promethium fuel for orc war machines, to hammer out armor plates to reinforce their looted tanks. I was put on a team that operated a press, stamping out artillery shell casings. These were then filled with explosives by another crew across the facility. I feared for them. One slip up and they'd be blown sky high. Such accidents did happen, and the orcs didn't care about casualties, only lost productivity. The press was partly broken. Its machine spirit, if it had one, surely wept at the abuse it took. Every 10th casing came out malformed. We'd have to toss the duds into a scrap heap. The orc overseer, a one-eyed brute with a temper, noticed the pile of rejects growing by the hour. Finally, he stomped over, demanding to know why we were wasting good metal. Our foreman, an older man named Kalin, who'd overseen this plant under the Imperium, mustered his courage and explained that the press alignment was off, that we needed time to recalibrate, or the shells would be unusable. The orc listened, head cocked like he barely understood. Then, without a word, he grabbed Foreman Kalin by the neck and dragged him to the press. With horrifying strength, he forced Kalin's arm under the giant stamping die. "Fix it, Den," the orc snarled, and slammed his palm on the activation rune. The press came down in a flash. It stamped the outline of a shell casing through Callan's forearm. The scream that man let out, "Emperor have mercy." Blood spurted, bones shattered. The Ork laughed as he released the now one-armed foreman, who collapsed in shock. "Anyone else want to calibrate?" the overseer asked us with a grin, waving the bloody stump of Callan's arm as if it were a toy. We got the press working better after that, not because the demonstration imparted any technical insight, but because we were scared out of our minds and worked literally non-stop to manually correct the alignment issues. We ended up shimming the die with scraps until it was somewhat straighter, a jury-rigged solution that fortunately satisfied our one-eyed tormentor. Callan didn't survive. We tried to bandage him, but with no real Medicae supplies and the Orks not allowing a break to properly tend to him, he bled out on the factory floor within the hour. We had to carry on working inches from his corpse until shift's end. Eventually, a couple of us were permitted to drag his body out. I made sure to whisper the Emperor's prayer for him as we laid him by the door. Burying people properly wasn't an option. Bodies of fallen workers were typically tossed on a flatbed cart and later dumped in a mass grave out back. The Orks weren't about to give burial detail time off. So that was work life. Back-breaking labor punctuated by moments of sheer terror whenever an Ork noticed something displeasing. We lived under the gun quite literally. Ork Rundhards, overseers, prowled the factory aisles with spiked whips. Lazy or slow. Whack. You collapse from exhaustion. Whack. You make a mistake that costs time or materials. Emperor help you, you might just get a bullet instead of a whip. And yet, we endured. Humans can grow used to almost anything, I suppose. There's a grim routine that forms even in hell. You focus on the next hour, the next task, because thinking beyond that is too overwhelming. After a typically brutal workday, they'd march us back to our designated living quarters. I hesitate to call them homes. We largely squatted in whatever structures remained semi-intact near our workplaces. Entire families, what families were left, would share single offices or storage rooms with rubble for beds. I personally slept on the floor of a blown-out classroom with about 10 other single men. The desks pushed aside, broken glass swept into a corner. Each night before curfew, a tired hush fell over these impromptu barracks as we tended to our meager needs, binding wounds with dirty cloth, sharing the day's rumors in whispers, maybe praying quietly. Candlelight, or glow lamp if someone scavenged batteries, illuminated gaunt faces and shivering forms. It was a picture of a people in its darkest hour. Sometimes an Ork patrol would barge in even during curfew hours, just to keep us on our toes. They'd do a head count, maybe drag someone out for interrogation if something had irked them that day. Like if a tool went missing, someone would be blamed, often arbitrarily. We learned to dread the sound of heavy boots outside at night. One such night visit still makes me break out in sweat. An Ork Knob and his 2 grunts came into our classroom barracks well past midnight. We all snapped awake, terrified. The Knob had a huge chain axe resting on his shoulder, its motor idling. He glared at us with tiny red eyes and snarled, "Some of you lot been slacking. Boss thinks your work's too slow." We exchanged nervous looks. Was this just an intimidation visit or an execution party? He paced through the room, and we cringed away from his bulk. Finally, he singled out a young man, Tom, who worked with me on the presses. Tom was barely 20 and had a bad limp from a previous injury. The Knob grabbed him by the front of his shirt and hauled him up. "You making us look, poor weakling?" the Ork growled in his face. Tom shook his head frantically, stammering, No, I'm doing my best." The Ork dropped him with a thud. "Best ain't good enough," he snapped. Then, faster than our eyes could follow, the knob swung his chain axe down. The rotating teeth tore through Tom's leg just above the knee, shearing it off in a spray of blood. Tom collapsed, screaming in agony, his leg severed. The knob put a boot on the writhing boy and looked at the rest of us. "Now get faster or y'all getting trimmed." With that vile lesson delivered, he and his goons left, laughing. We did what we could for poor Tom, but he died by dawn from shock and blood loss. The orcs had made their point. After that, none of us dared so much as slow our pace at work, even if it killed us, and for some it did. Under such conditions, one might think our spirits would break completely. Many did break. Suicide was not uncommon in the early days. Someone would slip away and hang themselves with a belt, or just stop eating until illness took them. But others hardened. A grim resolve formed among some of us. If we were going to die, we'd at least die on our feet, or take an orc with us. Yet, any time angry whispers of rebellion started circulating, reality quickly quashed them. We had no weapons, were badly malnourished, and constantly surveilled. A frontal uprising would be slaughtered in minutes, and result in the extermination of everyone. Some talked about stealth, picking off lone orcs, sabotaging equipment slowly, but fear and fatalism often got the better of those plans. I recall one of my friends, Darren, a fellow machinist, saying during a whispered midnight conversation, "We're living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, they'll kill us all anyway. I'd rather go down fighting." A middle-aged woman, Leora, shook her head and replied, "And what of the Emperor's plan? Perhaps we suffer now so that one day we might be saved. We can't throw our lives away. Maybe the Imperium will return." There was a lot of that kind of deliberation in hushed tones. In the end, most were too frightened to do anything but comply and pray for deliverance. Weeks turned into months. The initial shock and bloodlust of the orcs gradually gave way to a sort of routine. Chaotic and perilous, but routine nonetheless. Warboss Grotstreg settled into his role as our tyrant overlord. He had his underbosses establish a rough command structure in the city. The orcs divided territory among their tribes or clans. For instance, the northwest sector, where our manufactorums were, became the domain of the mech boys and their labor gangs. That's where I was. The southern districts, with the big Grox farms and water treatment plant, were controlled by orc units focused on gathering supplies and breeding squigs. Essentially their agriculture division, if you can believe it. The downtown core around the palace was the Warboss's personal turf and barracks for his biggest and baddest knobs. Within those areas, different clans of orcs painted their crude insignias. We began to recognize them, the rampaging boar emblem of the Goff clan on heavily fortified bunkers. Goffs are the most brutal, warlike orcs, always eager for a fight. The red sun symbol of evil suns on any vehicle or workshop. They love speed and vehicles. Emperor help us when they'd race through the streets in scavenged buggies, running over anyone too slow to dodge. There were also the sneaky blood axes, who oddly wore bits of camouflage and even at times tried to talk to us somewhat civilly. They were mercenary-like and had weird ideas of tactics they imitated from humans. It was a mixed horde, all unified under Grotstreg's rule. One surprising element of orc occupation was their internal squabbles. Orcs are inherently aggressive, even to each other. With no battles to fight off-world immediately, they'd fight among themselves to blow off steam. These brawls happened daily. Two boys would argue over who got the bigger piece of squig meat and end up in a full-on fistfight. Or a knob would accuse another of not pulling weight, and they'd brawl with knives and axes in the street until one was bleeding out. Normally, this might be great for us. Let them kill each other. But it often spilled onto bystanders. I remember a day walking back from the factory when two orc drivers collided their trucks at an intersection right in front of us. Instead of exchanging insurance information, they leapt out and started shooting at each other. We scattered as stray bullets whizzed past. One of my workmates, Paul, caught a round in the belly and went down. The orcs didn't even notice the human they'd shot. Their fight went on until one managed to hack the other's arm off with a cleaver, sending the loser running. That victor then roared in triumph, took a swig of fungus brew, and drove off like nothing happened. We rushed to Paul's Kia side, but he was already gone, eyes staring lifeless at the sky. Another friend lost to the madness. We quietly dragged his body into an alley to avoid attention and said a quick prayer. The next day, someone from our group risked sneaking out after curfew to retrieve Paul's body and give him as proper a burial as we could, a shallow grave in a collapsed basement. Funerals were outlawed. Orcs saw congregations as potential troublemaking. But we held a few secret ones anyway to maintain our humanity. Sometimes the orcs would turn their violence directly into entertainment. About a month into the occupation, after they'd secured the major strategic points and were less on high alert, Warboss Grotstrig decided to celebrate his dominance. We got word, via the shrill grot announcer on a loudhailer, that there was to be a mandatory gathering at the old civic stadium, the large open-air arena in the city. Attendance was not optional. Any human who failed to show would be hunted down. We all feared it was a mass execution or some form of mass punishment. In a way, it was punishment, just not the kind we expected. Under heavy guard, thousands of us were marched to the stadium square. This was once a place of sports and unity. I remembered cheering for our Habs shockball team there in better times. Now it was overrun by greenskins, setting up some twisted carnival. Orc banners flapped from the stands. Loudspeakers blared crude orc music, a cacophony of banging metal and drums. In the center of the arena, the orcs had erected a makeshift stage and various contraptions I couldn't identify at first. Warboss Grotstrig was there, prominently positioned on a raised dais, lounging in what looked like an overseer's viewing box that had been refitted into a throne for him. Surrounding him were dozens of hulking knobs, and the closest thing orcs have to dignitaries. Some were guzzling fungus beer from kegs, others were squabbling or laughing. We humans were herded into the lower stands and onto the field itself, made to form a ring around a central open area. Orc guards with guns ringed us one layer outside, effectively making us spectators who dared not leave. The grot announcer from earlier pranced to the center with a crackling Vox amplifier. In his squeaky, high-pitched Gothic, he proclaimed, oh yes, you miserable gits. The great Governor Grotstrig has a show for ya. You's gonna watch and cheer or else?" "A show?" We exchanged uncertain, horrified glances. A few sobs rose from people who expected the worst. Personally, my heart was pounding. I steeled myself for whatever atrocity was coming. And then it began. The games. First up was something the orcs called the Runts race. From a side gate, they pushed out a group of human prisoners, about a dozen men and women. Many of them were young and relatively fit. I suspect these were people who had been caught resisting or trying to escape in prior days. Now they were being given an apparently sporting chance, which was no chance at all. The grot announced, "All right, humies, run fast. Last one alive wins, maybe." We didn't understand until they released the beasts. With a clang, another gate opened and out sprinted a pack of squigs, specifically attack squigs, which are like vicious dog-sized balls of teeth and muscle. Imagine a carnivorous, legged football with a mouthful of razors. That's a squig. They are often used by orcs to hunt or torment. The unfortunate prisoners on the field realized what was behind them and ran for their lives, a dozen squigs bounding after them. What unfolded was pure horror. The stadium rang with orc laughter as one by one the squigs tackled the fleeing humans. A few of the runners managed some impressively nimble moves. One fellow even stomped a squig's head in as it lunged at him. But their stamina was no match for creatures bred to chase prey. Within minutes, blood and torn limbs littered the arena floor. The winner, if you could call it that, was a young woman who by sheer luck was the last one cornered by the squigs. For a moment, we thought maybe they'd spare the final survivor. The grot had said last one alive wins. She was on her knees, sobbing as the squigs that had killed the others circled her, snarling and drooling. Warboss Gratstreg stood up from his seat, clearly enjoying the spectacle. He made a gesture with his power claw, a thumbs down, essentially. A roar of approval rose from the orcs. They released a final beast, not a squig this time, but a much larger shape lumbering out. An orc knob in heavy armor, wielding a chain cleaver. Apparently the finale was that this knob got the honor of finishing the job. He charged at the exhausted woman and, mercifully, ended her quick with one brutal swing that took her head from her shoulders. It was a mercy compared to being eaten alive. I wanted to vomit. Many around me were openly crying or retching. But then the grot announcer screeched, "Humies, cheer, clap for da winner." The orc guards glared at us, some raising guns. We understood. They wanted us to applaud this atrocity, to effectively cheer our own kind being butchered, for their amusement. That, or die ourselves. I clapped. I hated myself for it, but I clapped, and so did the thousands of others. A feeble, pitiful sound echoing under the stands. Some even forced shouts or cheers through sobs. I saw a man next to me, an elderly docent from the city library, clapping with blood trickling from where he'd bitten his lip clean through. Such was his anger and pain at having to play along. The orcs found our performance lacking. Some threw trash and rotten fungi at us in annoyance. "Louder, gits!" A couple of random people who weren't clapping enough got dragged out and beaten by orc guards right then and there, as encouragement. So we cheered louder, screaming until our throats were raw for the murder of innocents. The humiliation and horror of that moment sits like a stone in my soul. And the games weren't even over. Next, they set up what can only be described as gladiatorial matches. They dragged out another group of captives. These looked like former PDF who had fought bravely. They were scarred, and I saw a sergeant's insignia on one. The orcs threw them a few crude weapons, a rusted machete here, a spiked club there, then unleashed a half-tamed squigoth into the arena. A squigoth is like an elephant-sized reptilian monster that orcs sometimes use as a war beast. This one was smaller than full-grown, but still enormous to us, and they'd goaded it with prods into a foul temper. The prisoners actually put up a valiant effort, I'll give them that. They spread out, shouted to coordinate, tried to strike at the beast's more vulnerable underbelly. But facing such a creature with mere hand weapons, it was doomed. One man was stomped into paste almost immediately. Another got caught in its jaws and literally torn in half. The remaining three managed to wound its eye, which sent it into a frenzy of pain. It thrashed and gored them in short order. Again, we were forced to applaud our own people's slaughter. I felt something inside me fraying, like a wire pulled too taut. It might have been the moment where a seed of steely hatred planted itself so deep in my heart that fear alone could no longer eradicate it. Watching those brave men die for nothing, for orc sport, I swore to myself if I ever got a chance, even a sliver of a chance, I would make these monsters pay. The final spectacle that day was bizarre and chilling in a different way. After the blood sports, Warboss Grotsdrag himself took center stage. He announced, through the grot, that because he was so pleased with how the day went, he had a reward for us, his loyal subjects. With a flourish, they wheeled out carts of food into the stadium. Real food, not just squig slop. I squinted. Could it be? It was. There were loaves of bread, burnt and smashed, but recognizable, smoked meat. Emperor knows what creature, but it smelled savory. Even jugs of what might have been actual clean water or weak ale. Our captors then did something truly demented. They opened the gates and told us we could go collect our reward. Picture a mass of half-starved humans looking at the first decent meal in weeks, while a ring of heavily armed orcs surrounds them for fun. We were wary. Was this a trick? But hunger is powerful. Slowly, small groups inched toward the carts. When nothing immediate befell them, more followed. Soon it was a rush, people swarming the carts, grabbing bread, tearing at meat, gulping down water. And that's when the orcs sprung their joke. The food was free, yes, but there was far less than the number of people, deliberately insufficient by design. They wanted to see us fight each other for it. And we did. O throne, forgive us, we did. Once the first cart was emptied, those who got nothing turned on those who held armfuls of provisions. A scuffle broke out over a sack of flour, then a fistfight over a canister of water. Within moments, a full-blown riot of desperate humans was underway on the arena floor, exactly as the orcs intended. The greenskins laughed and cheered, taking bets even, as we scrabbled and brawled with each other like animals. I tried to stay out of it, but I was knocked down by two men wrestling over a haunch of meat. One of them, blind with hunger, started beating the other with a loaf of bread, absurd as that sounds, and I got caught under their feet. I might have been trampled if not for a friend, Darren, who pulled me up and helped drag me out of the fray. This reward quickly turned to chaos. A few orcs fired their guns in the air for added effect, spooking the crowd further. Eventually, when most of the food was gone, or ground into the dirt and dozens of people lay injured or unconscious, the orcs banged on their drums to signal an end. We limped away from that stadium brutalized, not just by orc cruelty, but by the cruelty we had shown one another. It was one of Grotsdrag's cleverer moves, break our spirit by making us betray our own humanity in front of each other. That night, back in our hovels, a heavy gloom hung over everyone, so much suffering for a few crusts of bread. It taught me something about the orcs. They didn't just want to kill us. That would be too simple. They wanted to dominate us, break us utterly, and amuse themselves in the process. We were cattle to them, yes, but also playthings. Governor Grotsdrag wasn't content to sit idly. He actively orchestrated misery to stave off his own boredom. Despite all this, some embers of resistance remained in human hearts. You can snuff out 100, 1,000, but somewhere the flame flickers on. In secret, little groups began to form, whispering about fighting back, about escape, about anything to change this fate. I'll admit I was initially too cowed to involve myself. I was just trying to survive one day to the next, praying to see my wife again somehow, somewhere. But fate, or perhaps the Emperor's subtle hand, would soon draw me into a plot much larger than myself. It was around 3 months into the occupation when I first heard rumors of a hidden resistance growing. I was working an extra shift one evening. The orcs sometimes forced us to continue working through the night if a particular job was behind schedule, sleep be damned. In the relative quiet of the assembly line, well, as quiet as it gets with clanking metal, I overheard 2 of my fellow workers murmuring behind a stack of crates. I caught snippets. Meeting, old tunnels, help from outside. At the phrase, help from outside, my ears perked. Outside? The Imperium? My heart fluttered at the thought. After shift, I carefully approached one of them, a skinny, sharp-eyed man named Gaius, who used to be a clerk in the administratum. Gaius and I were on nodding terms. I'd shared some water with him once when he nearly fainted from heat exhaustion. As we trudged back to the barracks in the pre-dawn gloom, I sidled up and whispered, "I heard you earlier. Is there really a meeting?" He gave me a quick, searching look. In those days, you had to be sure who you trusted, since collaborators and informers were a possibility. Some desperate souls did become snitches for better treatment. The orcs exploited that too. Apparently, he deemed me safe or desperate enough. He nodded ever so slightly. "Tonight," he breathed, barely audible. "After curfew, Sector 12 maintenance tunnel, the one near the collapsed granary. Pass it on only to those you trust with your life." I almost couldn't believe it. A secret gathering. It was practically suicidal to meet after curfew. Orc patrols combed the streets, and they had night vision gear looted from our armories. If they caught a bunch of us meeting, it would be a bloodbath. And yet, this might be a chance, the only chance to do something. My mind swirled the rest of the day. Should I go? Should I keep my head down instead? Fear warred with hope. In the end, hope, or perhaps fatalism, won. I decided to attend. If nothing else, I had to know if any plan or outside aid was coming. That night, I slipped away from my hab as silently as possible. A few others in my block also melted into the darkness with subtle nods to each other. Clearly, the word had spread carefully. We were like ghosts, flitting through our own ruined city, sticking to shadows, avoiding the pools of light from the occasional still-functioning lumen globes. The orcs kept some power running, though many areas went dark. My heart pounded with every distant orc laugh or clank I heard. At one point, we froze behind some rubble as two orc soldiers wandered by, arguing about who killed more humigits that day. They moved on, fortunately too engrossed in their boastful spat to notice a handful of skinny humans trembling a few meters away in the dark. Sector 12's maintenance tunnel was near the old granary silos, which were mostly destroyed. There's a sub-level under them that connects to sewer and utility tunnels, an access point for city workers. We found the heavy steel hatch partially blown open, likely from the initial invasion bombardment. One by one, we slipped inside the tunnel, descending a ladder into a subterranean passage lit only by faintly luminous fungus. Orc spores, already taking root underground. About 20 people had gathered by the time I got there. It was a motley bunch. I recognized a few faces from the factory, a couple from my neighborhood, and one that made me pause. Sister Hannah, the medicae who had tended wounds after the initial invasion. She was a gentle woman, known by many as Sister Mercy for her kindness. To see her here in the company of what looked like some tough former PDF troopers hinted that this might be more serious than just desperate talk. Gaius was there and acknowledged me. The group formed a rough circle. In the dim glow, their eyes looked hollow but determined. We spoke in hushed tones. No one dared use real lights to avoid detection if an orc peered down a storm drain or such. An older man named Reynold, once an electrician, opened the proceedings. "Thank you all for coming. We don't have much time. The orcs suspect something is up. Patrols have been thicker. We must be brief." Brief, indeed. Just this meeting was incredible risk. They laid it out. A plan to sabotage the orcs' operations. Specifically, the grand project we had all heard whispers about. Warboss Grotstreg was building something big at the spaceport. We knew this. Everyone had seen the increased movement of scrap and fuel headed that way. Gaius, who had been reassigned to clerical work logging shipments for the orcs, quietly confirmed our fears. "It's a gargant," he said. "A damned gargant. They have us building them a walking war machine, a giant effigy of their gods. If they finish it, they could use it to destroy any Imperial force that tries to take the planet back, or even use it to launch off-world for further conquest." A collective shudder went through us. A gargant is like a parody of the God Emperor's blessed titans, a huge orc war engine, all guns and crude power. I'd never seen one, but the legends from other war fronts were dire. One gargant can level a city by itself, and we were unwittingly helping them build it piece by piece. The sabotage plan was straightforward but suicidal. A small team would infiltrate the spaceport workshops where the Gargant's fuel and ammo were stored, and set off explosives to cripple or destroy the monstrosity before it could be completed. Obviously, explosives were hard to come by, but not impossible. There were still unexploded ordnance around, and some of the workers had smuggled out bits of munitions. An old mining explosives expert, Grayson, had managed to squirrel away some blasting charges he recovered from a half-ruined mining depot outside the city. He had them in a satchel at his feet, maybe 4 or 5 charges, not much, but placed right they might ignite larger stockpiles. The plan hinged on timing and diversion. If we could coordinate a distraction, say a sudden uprising or riot in one part of the city, the orcs might be drawn away from the spaceport momentarily, giving the saboteur team a window to slip in and blow the charges. It was insane. It required sacrificing many lives as diversion for a slim chance at success. But after the games at the stadium and daily brutalities, there were enough volunteers willing to risk it. As this plan was discussed, I noticed Sister Hannah, Sister Mercy, was oddly quiet, eyes closed as if in prayer. When she opened them, there was a strange glint. She spoke softly. "Brothers, sisters, we might not need throw lives away in distraction. There is another path. We have friends who can provide the needed diversion when the time comes." There was a hush. Friends? What friends could we have? One of the former PDF men, a grizzled sergeant named Oren, frowned. "You mean those rumors about outsiders?" Sister Hannah gave a thin smile. "Yes, I speak of the Star Children." At that phrase, a couple of people gasped or recoiled. I myself felt a chill. The Star Children. I'd heard that phrase in some desperate whispered prayers lately from certain fellow workers. Not an Imperial term. Something else. She continued with a quiet fervor. "We have been forsaken by the false Emperor, but the Star Children, the true gods beyond the veil, have heard our cry. They have sent blessed messengers already, hidden among us, bolstering our strength. At the ordained time, they will strike down our enemies and lift up the faithful. All they ask is our faith and assistance in preparing the way." A dreadful realization crept over me. Sister Mercy was part of some cult, likely a genes stealer cult from the sound of it. Those insidious Xenos worshippers who turn humans to the worship of Tyranids as saviors. I had dismissed such talk as ravings, but now it was right here among our supposed resistance. I glanced around and saw a few nodding along with her, eyes distant and hopeful. Others looked uneasy, like me. The meeting suddenly took on a dangerous tenor. We weren't all on the same page, not by a long shot. Sergeant Oren voiced what I was thinking. "Sister, with respect, I fight for the God Emperor and for humanity, not for Xenodevils. The Tyranids are no saviors. They'd consume us just as readily as these orcs." Hannah's face twisted in a shadow of anger. "And where is your God Emperor now, Sergeant? Did he save your family? Did he strike down the orcs? No. But our gods have sent visions. They have great beings on the way, children of the stars who will deliver us. Perhaps in form they seem fearsome, but they will spare those who have their blood and usher us into a new age." It was at that moment I realized with horror, she wasn't fully human anymore. A gene-stealer cult's leaders, their so-called magi or priestesses, often have the taint, maybe subtle but present. In the gloom, I hadn't seen it clearly, but as she grew excited, I glimpsed something like a serpentine flicker in her pupils, and her canines were slightly elongated. "Emperor, preserve us. We had a hybrid, or at least a deeply indoctrinated cult leader in our midst." Gaius and Renaud, who had organized the meeting, exchanged worried glances. This was not what they had envisioned, clearly. Gaius stepped forward, raising his hands. "It doesn't matter whose gods we invoke, Emperor or Star Children," he said diplomatically. "What matters is killing the greenskins and surviving. If Sister Hana's plan can cause a diversion, I say we consider it. We need every edge." I bit my tongue. The last thing we needed was to replace one Xenomaster with another, but I saw the practicality. If some cultists were embedded and ready to cause havoc, that could help the sabotage. The moral and spiritual ramifications we could worry about if we lived through this. The debate was cut short by a distant sound up above, a growl of an Ork engine. An armored truck rumbled somewhere on the streets. We all fell silent, tense. Thankfully, it faded away, but it was a stark reminder. Curfew patrols were out. We dare not linger too long. In the end, it was agreed. We would attempt the sabotage in 3 days' time. That would coincide with a scheduled large gathering of orcs for some religious ceremony they called the Great Waaagh. Basically, a big war council and party for the orc bosses. Many orcs would be distracted, drunk likely at that event near the palace. Additionally, Sister Hana assured us that certain actions would be taken by her cult's adherents that night elsewhere to throw the orcs into confusion. I wasn't privy to details, which was fine by me. Sergeant Oren and Grayson, the demolitions man, volunteered to infiltrate the spaceport and set the charges, since they had knowledge of explosives and some military stealth training. I volunteered too. To my own surprise, the words came out of my mouth before I fully thought it through. "I'll go with them. I've worked that site, know the layout," I whispered. It was true. I had been part of a crew that delivered machine parts to the spaceport workshops, and truthfully, after everything, I felt a grim momentum pushing me. If I could strike a blow, even at the cost of my life, perhaps it would mean something. The faces of all those lost, my wife chief among them, haunted me. I wanted to hurt our oppressors, to at least try. Oren clapped my shoulder silently in thanks. Grayson gave a curt nod. That was our little sabotage team. A soldier, a miner, a factory hand. None of us exactly expert infiltrators, but we had determination. With the plan set, we carefully dispersed, each taking different routes back to avoid drawing notice. Sister Hana caught my eye as we parted, giving me a serene smile. "The Star Children will remember your bravery," she said softly. I didn't respond. I just slipped away, troubled by the implications of throwing in our lot with those cultists. But one war at a time. First the orcs, then we could sort out any cult problem if any of us lived. The next 3 days were some of the longest of my life. Knowing a deadly mission approached made every hour drag with anxious weight. Yet I had to act normal, go about work as if nothing was amiss. I suspect the others in on the plan felt the same. One slip, one nervous glance at the wrong time, and the orc overseers might sniff out something. Orcs aren't exactly master psychologists, but they aren't complete fools either. Any whiff of organized resistance, and they respond with brute force. Interestingly, on the second day before the mission, we noticed Ork behavior shifting. They seemed a bit on edge, more irritable, even for orcs. Patrols were indeed thicker at night, as Gaius had warned. Something had them spooked or suspicious. I worried. Had they caught wind of the meeting? Or perhaps Sister Hannah's cult had done something prematurely. That same day, I witnessed something odd. An orc patrol rushing through a marketplace area, shooting at shadows. When things calmed, I sneaked over to see what they were firing at. I found a dead creature that certainly wasn't orc, a lithe, chitinous beast with 6 limbs and a whip-like tail. Emperor's Mercy, it looked like a pure strain gene stealer, one of the Tyranid infiltrators. What was it doing here now? Did the cultists unleash it? Possibly one of their messengers got loose or was deliberately sicked on an orc. It killed a couple of greenskins. Their bodies were nearby, torn open, which explained the agitated patrols. This discovery filled me with dread. If Tyranid creatures were already skirmishing with orcs in the underbelly of our city, we were sitting on a time bomb of another sort. The cult clearly hoped to time a Tyranid incursion to coincide with their uprising, basically swapping one xeno threat for another. From their perspective, better the devourer you worship than the devil that enslaves you, I guess. I didn't have time to warn others of this, but presumably Sister Hannah's group knew what they were doing, or thought they did. Either way, the orcs were now a bit distracted, dealing with these underground pests. If anything, that might play to our advantage. They might attribute any odd sabotage activity to those elusive creatures rather than organized human action. Small comfort. Finally, the night of nights came. The Warboss's big gathering, the Waaagh, was kicking off at their fortress, the palace. We could hear their revelry even from kilometers away. Boisterous chanting, gunfire into the air, constant tracers arcing like a macabre fireworks show, drums pounding. Most orcs not on guard duty were there or in the streets, carousing in celebration of their rule, or whatever orcs celebrate. It was as good a cover as we'd get. Our plans synchronized with Sister Hannah's cultists as well. At a certain hour, they promised the beginning of the uprising. I still didn't know exactly what they'd do. Incite the crowds, unleash more hidden genes, stealer organisms, plant bombs of their own. Perhaps all of the above. Sergeant Oren, Grayson, and I met near the edge of the spaceport complex just after midnight. The spaceport used to be a bustling hub, but since the invasion it was repurposed entirely for orc use, mostly as a construction yard for the Gargant. The silhouette of that monstrosity loomed against the night sky, an irregular, blocky giant standing perhaps 30 meters tall already, scaffold and cranes surrounding it. They'd been working on it relentlessly. It now possessed a bulbous head-like structure, and 2 massive arm appendages were being fitted. One looked like a cannibalized plasma reactor, turned into a mega cannon. The other a giant claw built from a dozen industrial cranes fused together. It wasn't finished yet, thank the Emperor. If it were fully operational, we'd probably not even get this chance. Of course, the site was guarded. We observed from behind a wrecked shuttle at the perimeter. A few floodlights illuminated sections of the workyard. Orc mech boys and their assistants were still active even at this hour. Orcs will labor ceaselessly on something that interests them, especially their beloved war machines. We counted about 24 orcs in the immediate area, some patrolling, some operating cranes or welding on the Gargant, others moving to and fro delivering parts. Not many, considering how huge the project was, likely because most orcs were at the party. They probably left just enough crew to keep the machine work going overnight and to guard important assets like the ammo dumps. Crucially, we noted 3 large storage sites. One looked to be a Promethium fuel depot, a cluster of barrels and tanks near an old hangar structure. Another was a munitions cache. Several stacks of artillery shells, crates of smaller ammo, and some surpluses of gunpowder. Probably an unsafe open-air magazine, typical Ork disregard for safety. And the third, at the foot of the gargant itself, was a pile of spare power cells and machinery, likely parts of its power plant and weapons. Grayson had the charges. Our aim was to plant them at the fuel and munitions spots. That should create massive secondary explosions to wreck the gargant, or at least halt construction. We synchronized our pocket chrono devices. I had a battered timer, Oren a stolen wristwatch. We'd give ourselves about 15 minutes to get in position and plant before any diversions from elsewhere started, which we expected around midnight, 30 local time. The infiltration began. We crawled under a gap in the perimeter fence, a fence the Orks had partly demolished and never fully repaired. Arrogance on their part, assuming no slaves would dare approach. Immediately, we hugged the shadows behind a row of derelict cargo landers. 2 Ork guards were smoking and arguing about something by a bonfire to our left, maybe 50 meters off. Not paying keen attention. We skirted wide around them, moving from cover to cover. One tense moment. As we crossed a lit patch between a broken Chimera chassis and a stack of crates, a grot came wandering out of a side door, dragging a sack of scrap. We froze in place. The grot was maybe 10 meters away. He looked straight at us. My blood turned to ice. But his eyes passed over without reaction. We were pressed against the crates, in dark clothing against dark metal. Maybe he didn't register us as humans? Or perhaps the little idiot's eyesight was poor in the gloom outside the lit area. He continued on, mumbling to himself, and disappeared around a corner. We let out a collective silent exhale and moved on. We split up near the targets. Sergeant Oren made for the munition stacks. I headed toward the fuel depot, and Grayson went with me. Since he had the charges, he'd plant one at fuel with me, and then go join Oren to plant at munitions. The plan was then to rendezvous back near the gap and detonate with wired or timed charges as we fled. As I crept toward the fuel depot, I got a closer look at the Ork mech boys at work. Several were atop the gargant, welding a massive metal plate onto its hull. Sparks showered down like evil stars. The gargant's maw-like face was illuminated. It had a grill of jagged metal teeth easily taller than a man. A low thrum came from it. They might have been testing some systems. The thought of that thing powering up fully sent a shiver through me. It could probably level our whole city if completed. I slithered under a stand holding a few large promethium tanks. My heart was thudding so loudly I was sure it'd attract attention. Grayson was a few paces behind, expertly silent for a burly miner. We placed one charge at the base of the largest fuel tank. It was basically a shaped bundle of powder and grenades wired to a simple timer detonator he'd cobbled. Grayson was clever with improvised munitions. He set it for 10 minutes, giving us a window to get clear and also sync with the second blast. Suddenly, voices, harsh and barking. An Ork was approaching, grumbling to another about getting more juice for Dageni. We realized they were coming to the fuel depot. Grayson and I ducked behind some barrels as 2 Ork mech assistants stomped in. One yawned, showing off his disgusting tusks, and kicked a smaller grot, ordering it to start pumping promethium from a tank into a drum. We were about 5 meters away, hidden in shadow behind a row of 50-gallon drums, praying none of the goblins would wander our way. I clutched a rusty knife I had scavenged. Pitiful defense if we were discovered. Grayson, I saw, clutched a stub pistol, one shot, stolen ages ago and carefully hoarded. It was all he had. We exchanged a knowing look. If we were spotted, we'd have to fight quickly and hope to silence them before an alarm. The grot began whistling a horribly off-tune melody as he worked the pump. The orcs were complaining about the taste of the fungus beer at the party, and one was saying he preferred good old promethium fumes. They were distracted, facing away. Eventually, agonizingly slow, the fueling task finished. One orc hefted the now full drum, and the pair started to leave. Then one paused and sniffed the air. "Oi, smell that? Smells like umi," he growled. My blood froze. Yes, we probably stank of fear and unwashed human, very distinct from orc musk. His comrade snarled, "Probably your upper lip. Come on." He guffawed, and they moved off, thankfully. We waited a few breaths longer, then slipped away opposite direction. I silently thanked the God Emperor, or whoever might be watching, that we hadn't had to try our luck against two orc brutes in melee. Charges set at fuel. Check. Now, Grayson parted to go assist Oren. I made my way to the rendezvous slowly, trying to stay invisible. I had about 6 minutes left on the timer and needed to be clear of the blast radius, which for those fuel tanks would be considerable, I assumed. As I was passing near an orc troop carrier wreck, I heard the first distant commotion beyond the spaceport. A faint explosion, then another. Gunfire, lots of it, popping off across the city. That had to be the cultists or other saboteurs initiating the distraction. Sure enough, moments later, an alarm horn sounded from the palace direction. Orc voices shouted in alarm now instead of merriment. The patrols around the spaceport reacted too. The two orc guards we'd seen smoking ran toward the noise, eager for a fight. Orcs rarely resist a call to battle, even if they don't know what it is. Several other workers downed tools and began piling on trucks or revving war bikes to head toward the shooting. It was happening. All hell breaking loose. This was both good and bad. Good that orcs were preoccupied. Bad that our own position might become chaotic. I saw in the distance, beyond the city walls, an eerie sight. Green and purple flashes like some bioluminescence or weird energy discharge. Could it be the cult's promised friends? Tyranids, perhaps small vanguard organisms, skirmishing with orcs at the outskirts. It certainly looked not of human origin. The orcs at the spaceport cursed, and some began mobilizing outwards. Sergeant Oren emerged from behind a stack of crates ahead, waving me over in a low crouch. I scampered to him. He had a gash on his forehead but looked exhilarated. "Munitions charge set," he reported. "Grayson's priming it now. We ran into a bit of trouble but solved it." I saw a dead orc, half hidden in the shadows nearby, throat slit. Oren's combat knife was bloody. Good man. Grayson joined us a half-minute later, cradling a slight wound on his arm. It looked like a bullet graze. "Charge 2 live, 3-minute fuse," he panted. "Then we need to run, now," I urged. The three of us bolted towards the fence line, sticking to cover but not wasting time with perfect stealth anymore. We had to be clear. The diversions had pulled many eyes away, though a few orcs still in the yard noticed movement. I heard a guttural shout, then wild gunshots crackling behind us. We kept running, zigzagging. None of us were hit, though the zip and snap of slugs passing by was terrifyingly close. We dived under the fence gap just as a huge fireball whooped behind us. The fuel depot went up in a pillar of flame that lit the night. The shockwave flung me forward like a doll, tumbling in the dirt. Ears ringing, I staggered up. The entire spaceport was an inferno now. Secondary explosions as more tanks and probably the ammo cache began cooking off. Then a second blast, likely the munitions stack we rigged. Boom! It rattled the very ground. I saw a massive chunk of something, part of the Gargant's arm, cartwheeling through the air on fire. The Gargant itself took a direct hit from one of those blasts. A chain reaction of ammo must have sent shrapnel through it. With a groan of tortured metal, I watched the great war machine topple. Its legs buckled and it crashed sideways into the ground, collapsing scaffolds and cranes as it fell. A cloud of fire and smoke engulfed it. When the dust settled momentarily, the Gargant was a broken silhouette, half its torso torn open, lying on its side. I felt a fierce grin on my face. We did it. Emperor's tears, we did it. We crippled the beast. Oren clapped me on the back, yelling something I couldn't hear, ears still ringing. I just nodded and gestured to move. We couldn't celebrate here. Grayson was limping from the blast impact, but moving. Behind us, the spaceport was chaos. Any orcs still alive there were certainly not thinking about chasing 3 humans. They were busy trying to douse flames, or just reeling in shock. The chain of blasts probably convinced them they were under full attack. We melted into the alleyways of the city. The night was a cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and alien roars. It wasn't just our sabotage now. It was full-scale pandemonium. I saw shapes darting across a rooftop ahead. Not human, not orc. Sleek, many-limbed shadows. Jeans stealers. They were pouncing on an orc heavy gunner nest, ripping throats out. The orcs hollered and fought back, some dying, some blasting the creatures apart even as they were overrun. It was a surreal 3-way battle now. Orcs versus rebellious humans versus tyrannid infiltrators. We tried to avoid any direct confrontations, skirting skirmishes as we aimed for a safe house location Reynold, the electrician from the meeting, had designated earlier, the basement of an old administratum building. Along the way, we encountered a small group of fellow rebels, humans armed with looted orc pistols and makeshift weapons, engaging an orc patrol at a barricade. We joined in to help, our blood up and feeling like maybe tonight, just maybe, we could reclaim our city or at least make a bold stand. It was a vicious little fight. I smashed an orc's face with a pipe as he was about to shoot a young woman in the rebel group. Oren shot another in the back with a scavenged slugger. We took some casualties too. One of our guys got cleaved by an orc chopper, poor bastard. But ultimately, we cleared that street. The surviving orcs retreated, maybe thinking it not worth it with so much else going on. But any dream of full victory was short-lived. As we paused to catch breath, we heard a new sound on the wind, a deep droning war horn from the direction of the palace. Then another and another. Orc rally signals. The Warboss was calling his boys to regroup, to crush the uprisings. Our easy wins would not last. The real hammer was coming. Sure enough, not long after, the night was pierced by the roar of engines en masse. Wartrucks and buggies carrying dozens of orc reinforcements began tearing through the city from the palace side. They had regrouped faster than we hoped. One such convoy barreled down the avenue we were on. We scrambled for cover. A pickup truck retrofitted with a heavy shooter, opened up, spraying the road with big caliber rounds. The young woman who fought with us was hit and went down screaming. I pressed myself behind a fallen column, bullets chewing the stone around me. Oren grimaced. Time to vanish. We did what we came to do. This fight's gonna turn. He was right. The orcs vastly outnumbered us and, once organized, would overpower any ragtag human revolt and contained tyrannid incursions. Already I could hear the pitched battles intensifying, with the distinct orc victory whoops getting more frequent. They were rallying and counterattacking fiercely. Reluctantly, I followed the sergeant and Grayson as we slipped away from the avenue down a side alley. I felt guilt leaving those other humans to the orcs' wrath, but Oren was right. Staying would just get us killed uselessly. We had to hope the chaos we caused would at least let some escape or hide. By pre-dawn, the city was a war zone again, reminiscent of that first invasion day. Fires raged, bodies, orc and human alike, and some tyrannid monstrosities too, littered the streets. The uprising was collapsing. Any gunfire now was sporadic and one-sided in the Orks' favor. The Xeno cult likely went to ground or was wiped out after their initial strike. I suspected Sister Hana either fled or was killed. I didn't know. Without coordination or heavy weapons, our fellow survivors couldn't hold off the Ork masses long. But one objective was secured. The Gargant was destroyed. In the morning light, a column of black smoke marked the spaceport. That alone felt like a victory, a blow delivered to the enemy's gut. We three hid in the basement safe house as things settled. By midday, Ork loudspeakers, mobile ones on trucks, since we'd downed some of their fixed ones, blared an angry message. "Stupid gits, you think yous can fight the Orks? Nice try, but yous dead now. Any Humi not back to work by sundown gets executed. No more chances. Waaagh!" Warboss Gratstreg's voice boomed among those, promising mercy. Ha! To any who submitted and death to all others. Standard tyrant stuff. We didn't plan on submitting. For a couple days we laid low, scavenging supplies at night. The Orks were on high alert after the uprising, more brutal than ever in stamping out dissent. They conducted sweeps, executed many captives they suspected of involvement. The lampposts on main streets were adorned with fresh human corpses again as warnings. But they also had to contend with lingering tyrannid critters prowling in sewers. I heard occasional skirmish sounds from below ground, which indicated the cult infestation hadn't been fully eliminated. So, ironically, the Orks' attention was split. This gave us, and perhaps other small groups, a chance to slip through cracks. Oren, Grayson, and I eventually decided the city was too hot. Our successful sabotage might make us legendary among prisoners if known, but it also meant if we were caught, a fate worse than death awaited. Orks do like their torture. We made a pact to try and escape Veridian Prime and reach the wilderness, maybe find partisans or just survive on the fringe. Who knows, maybe we could even link up with any approaching Imperial forces if they'd finally come now that things had boiled over. Before leaving, I did something personal. I visited the ruins of the Administratum archives, where my wife had worked. I searched vainly for any sign of her. All I found was rubble and ashes. In a corner, I recognized a scorched metal frame that once was her cogitator desk. I stood there a long while, tears finally coming. I said goodbye to Karina in my heart. I think somehow I knew then that she was gone, her soul with the Emperor. But I also felt that she, and all our lost, would be proud that we fought back, however briefly, against the darkness. The final goodbye I paid was to the city itself. As we slipped away into the Highlands forest outside the city limits under cover of a stormy night, I looked back from a ridge. Veridian Prime smoldered with patches of sear. The Grand Palace was a blackened husk. Ork banners still flew, but one could imagine the cost they paid in blood for that Pyrrhic hold. They won this round. The revolt was crushed. But the Warboss had been denied his prize war machine and had his nose bloodied badly. In the grand scheme, some might say nothing changed. Orks still ruled the ruins, and we few survivors were fleeing into uncertainty. But I'll tell you what did change. Hope. For the first time since the damn Orks arrived, they tasted fear and setback. And we humans, downtrodden and outgunned, tasted a bit of freedom, however brief, and proved to ourselves that the Orks were not invincible. The cost was enormous and the victory incomplete, but it was something. I write this now from a hidden encampment in the forests, weeks after those events. There are about 30 of us here. We linked up with some escaped folks and even a wounded PDF officer who fled to the hills during the original invasion. We're an unlikely band, veterans, factory workers, even a former arbitrator, but united in purpose to harry the greenskins whenever possible, to survive, and to await the day the Imperium returns. Warboss Gratstreg remains the self-styled governor of our world for now. Word is he's furious, paranoid, and doubling down on oppression in the city. His ego badly bruised. Good. Let him stew. He lost many good boys and his precious Gargant, and has nothing to show for it but a restive slave population and a dangerous xeno-cult problem underground. Honestly, sometimes I wonder if the orcs will tear themselves apart with paranoia about more Yumi tricks or fighting those genes Stealer spawn popping up. One can hope. Life in the mountains is hard and supplies are low, but I feel more alive than I did in those long months of servitude. Every day is a gift of freedom, however tenuous. We raid occasional orc convoys for food. We even saved a group of slaves they were transporting to an outpost the other week, bolstering our numbers. With each small victory, I see the fire in my fellows' eyes grow brighter. The orcs taught us what it meant to lose everything. In doing so, they forged our resolve from steel. I won't lie, the nights are still cold and filled with terrors. Sometimes I wake up from dreams of those terrible days. The screams in the stadium, the sight of that little boy clutching his mother in the shelter, the face of my wife as she kissed me goodbye the morning of the invasion, the last time I saw her smile. Those memories fuel a sorrow and rage I didn't know a person could hold. But they also remind me why I fight, why any of us fight. We may be mere mortals against the worst the galaxy has to offer. Savage orcs, insidious cults, hungry tyrannids. But we have something those beasts will never understand. Human spirit. We endure. We rebuild. We remember who we are and what we stand for. Warhammer 40K is a grim, dark universe. I've lived it. I've seen its horrors up close. And yet, here at this story's end, I find a glimmer that even in the grimmest darkness, a stubborn light persists. In me, in those alongside me, in the idea of the Imperium that, despite its many flaws, still inspires devotion to something greater than oneself. Perhaps I will die tomorrow in an orc ambush or a tyrannid raid. If so, I accept it, because I did not bow meekly to die a slave. I stood, I fought, I lived as a human being, defiant to the end. Death at the hands of an orc used to be my greatest fear. Not anymore. There are far worse fates. We tasted them, we survived them, and we rose anew. If death comes now, it comes on my terms, with a weapon in hand and a curse on my lips for those green bastard invaders. This was the story of what happened when an orc became governor of my planet. It's not a happy tale. Billions died and our world will never be the same. But it's not an entirely hopeless tale either. In the ashes of subjugation, we found our resolve. The orc rule taught me a kind of grim wisdom. The tyranny lasts only as long as fear outweighs anger. Once the dam breaks, once people have nothing left to lose, even the fiercest bully can be brought low. Governor Ork Gratstrig might still sit on his stolen throne for now, but he sits uneasy, nursing wounds we gave him. One day, Emperor willing, he'll fall for good, whether by our continued resistance or by the Emperor's angels of death descending from the sky to reclaim this world. I end this account watching a new dawn break over the jagged horizon. The sun's light spills over the ruins of my home city in the distance. It's eerily beautiful. In that light, the shadow of the orc banners seems a little less daunting. A new day, a new chance. We're not defeated. As long as one human soul draws breath free and defiant, the orcs haven't won. Life under their rule was a hell I wouldn't wish on anyone, a cruel, absurd, and deadly comedy of oppression. But we endured that hell and we struck back from it. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I do know this: humanity will endure. The orcs thought us weak, they wanted us broken. Instead, they forged us into something stronger. In the end, that will be their downfall. And to Warboss, Governor Grotstreg, if somehow these words ever reach your foul ears, enjoy your throne while you can, you ugly brute. Your days are numbered. We're coming for you again and again, from the shadows and the rubble. Every surviving man, woman, and child who refuses to kneel. This planet may be yours today, but tomorrow is ours, for the Emperor, for Veridian Prime. And to any who finds this account, know that we fought with all we had. Remember us, and do not pity. Instead, carry the fight forward. In darkness, a light endures. You wanted to know what it's like when an orc becomes the governor of a human world? It's hell, a hell of brutality and dark humor and unimaginable pain. But even in that hell, humanity did not go quietly into the void. That, above all, is the lesson of Veridian Prime under the greenskin yoke. We are hardest to conquer just when we are at our lowest. In the grim darkness of our time, that is as close to a happy ending as one gets.